When it comes to the situation in Afghanistan, one man tells it how it is. Anand Gopal has been bringing the world extensive coverage from the region for publications like the Wall Street Journal and the Christian Science Monitor. His latest headline reveals that even under the Obma administration, the United States continues to conduct night raids and run secret detention prisons in the region. He joins me today to discuss. Anand, thank you so much for being here. So you wrote this fascinating piece that was basically based on 24 interviews from former Afghan detainees and their experiences and what their families went through. Can you talk about some of the most shocking things that they told you about that?
Certainly. More than half of them alleged abuse in the detention process. The most shocking of all was one person who accused U.S. forces of waterboarding him. It's forcing him to swallow large amounts of water. There's people who talked about being hung upside down from chains. The people who alleged that dogs were used against them to scare them. Other people were alleging that they were stripped naked and made to assume stress positions or made to stand on their knees for extended periods of time.
Are you saying then that there is essentially no difference between the policies of the Bush administration and the Obama administration? Because you have officials in the Obama administration saying, look, we don't waterboard anymore, we don't torture, there's all kinds of new rules and regulations when it comes to interrogations.
There are certainly new rules and regulations, but a lot of this stuff is happening sort of unofficially in small field prisons or en route to these small field prisons. And so a lot of the regulations have been in place for the bigger prisons. For example, Bagram, which is the biggest prison in Afghanistan. Many Afghans call it Obama's Gitmo. That's Obama's Guantanamo. And for Afghans, Bagram is their Guantanamo. The typical detainee will be captured in a night raid. This is when U.S. troops will come in the middle of the night and often take somebody on some suspicion. They'll then be taken to a small prison that's usually on a U.S. military base, although there are also other secret prisons that are off the military bases, some of which we don't even know about at this point. They're held there for 3 or 4 days. They're interrogated. It's at this point where most people allege abuse takes place. Then interrogators will determine whether these people are actually a threat to them or not. And if they deem them to be a threat, then they'll send them off to Bagram, which is the big prison.
Well, it's interesting because a lot of these cases, or most of these cases, have to do with government employees. Help me to understand that. If the United States wants to work with the government of Afghanistan, then how is it doing this? Is the Karzai government aware that this is going on?
They are, but...
Are they okay with it?
They're not, and, a lot of these are government employees. And
so is the U.S. basically, stepping over the government of Afghanistan, including Hamid Karzai, the president, when they do this?
Yeah, the U.S. has sole authority, especially on the night raids. And the Afghan government has tried, but to no avail, tried to get them to curtail them or tried to get the Afghan security forces to be involved in these operations. But these special operations forces who are carrying these out sort of are doing it unilaterally, separate from the Afghan government, even separate from other conventional U.S. military forces.
Is there some kind of legality behind it that they could say, okay, we're doing this and it's legal because it says it here or here or here?
It's a murky issue. According to Afghan law, only Afghan security forces are allowed to detain and interrogate people. So according to that, they would be illegal.
You bring up a good point in which you say that the Afghans have come to fear this more than coalition strikes, even in some villages, more than the Taliban itself. If the U.S. strategy is to win the hearts and minds of the local Afghan population, it's kind of difficult to do this in this light, right?
Right. Well, a lot of U.S. military officials talk about counterinsurgency, which is to try to win over the population and protect the population. But if you talk to a lot of these Afghans, they say they want to be protected from night raids, and they want to protect it from the Taliban, both equally. So if that's the goal, then it looks like the counterinsurgency doctrine isn't really being implemented in Afghanistan.
You mentioned this earlier, but I want to highlight one of the interviews you had with a former Afghan detainee in which he said, the interrogators blindfolded me, taped my mouth shut, and chained me to the ceiling. Occasionally, they unleashed a dog which repeatedly bit me. Then they forced me to swallow 12 bottles worth of water. And then this guy was, sort of quietly released. So when all is said and done, what is to say that he's not going to go back and try to seek revenge against the United States, that he's not going to go back and join the insurgency?
Well, I actually think you're right that there have been a lot of people who, at least their family members have been incarcerated or abused, or they themselves have, and they've turned to the insurgency. So I think this, instead of actually saving people from the insurgency, is actually creating more insurgents.
Let's talk about this notion of the economic Taliban. The Taliban leadership said, quote, attempts by the enemy obviously they're referring to the United States, right, and NATO forces, to bribe the Mujahideen, offering them money and employment to abandon jihad are futile. What do you make of that? Do you think that the U.S. will employ this strategy despite what this leader had said?
In Afghanistan, you have, as you mentioned, so many different tribes, different interests. Some tribes are opposed to other tribes. There's militias, there's warlords, and in all of that, it's very difficult to parse all that out and find the people who you need to pay. So what's usually ended up happening is there have been schemes already where coalition forces have tried to pay local groups to stop fighting, and often they've just taken the money and turned around and kept fighting.
We're seeing this trend, or what seems to be a trend, of moving toward a global Afghan settlement where you have all these different countries part of the negotiation process, and each country views the Taliban differently. But the emerging consensus seems to be that the Afghan jihadist movement, in one way or another, will be part of this new government, will be part of the equation. They talk about a reconciliation process. What do you make of all that?
I think this is the trend, because the Taliban are not going to drop their weapons unless they do take part in the government. And so I think a lot.
But how, on the part of the United States, how do you include those same people or that same entity in a government who you're fighting before that?
Well, I think the assumption is that they'll stop fighting first and then create a sort of new government with both sides. They're realizing that after 8 years of war, they haven't gotten very far, and so they're starting to look at radically different solutions.
If the United States doesn't pull out by July 2011, what is their role going to be still in the negotiation process diplomatically? And do you think that that date that Barack Obama said is realistic in the first place?
I don't think it's realistic, and I don't think they're going to pull out by July 2011. I think we're going to see sort of a protracted, drawn-out process where you'll still see U.S. troops on the ground.
For how much longer?
Well, I've heard figures 4, 5, 6 years. It really depends on how the war turns in the next couple of years.
You know, the president of Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai, said that regardless of when the U.S. pulls out troops, that his country is going to need U.S. assistance, whether financial or security, for another 10 to 15 years.
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, the Afghan state can't survive without foreign funders. If the United States government closes the purse strings, then the Afghan government will collapse tomorrow. The military, the police, everything is propped up by the U.S. So they completely rely on the U.S., not just for the next 10, 15 years, I mean, in perpetuity, unless there's some other fundamental solution that's found to be able to get the Afghan government to be self-sustaining. You
mentioned, the police force, and one of the key elements of the strategy is to really train the Afghan National Police Force so that they take responsibility of their country. But we've seen a lot of problems with that, whether it's the dropout rate or the sort of internal ethnic strife within that institution.
Well, especially the Afghan police, it seems very problematic, and if you talk to most Afghans, they hate the police more than they hate any other institution in the country. So there's many years to go before the police can reform. But this is why many other people are skeptical of the 2011 date, because there's no way the police will stand up on their own by that time.
We can't help but bring Pakistan into the equation here, a key player in all of this, but a political comeback of the Taliban would be a threat to Pakistan, right?
I think you need to bring the country to the equation if you're going to get anywhere, because the Afghan Taliban are covertly supported by Pakistan. If we want to rein in the Afghan Taliban or bring them into some sort of political solution, you need to have at least a tacit agreement of Pakistan. The drone strikes which are happening in the sort of tribal areas of Pakistan have really done a number on Al-Qaeda, and now Al-Qaeda is at its weakest point probably in the last 10 years because of them.
Talk about Iran's role, both in, between the United States and Afghanistan, and also in the negotiation process, in the global negotiation process.
Well, it's interesting because Iran is sort of supporting those elements that used to be called the Northern Alliance, which are now in the government, and they played a mostly positive role, in my opinion, of reconstruction and development. But there's a rivalry between Iran and Pakistan, and of course Iran and the United States, which is sort of being played out in Afghanistan.
Talk about this next year in Afghanistan for the United States. Obviously there's been a troop surge, 30,000 more troops over there. What can we expect to be in the headlines, or maybe even under the radar, in the next year or so?
Well, the next year is going to be crucial because it's going to be a test of whether all these troop surges actually worked. I think we're going to see more of the same. We're going to see sort of spectacular car bombings and suicide bombings in big cities, and you'll see the Taliban controlling large parts of the country, but with U.S. troops controlling cities and urban areas.
Thank you so much.